had a great deal of my voice from last night, so that's good news. I trust you all had a fantastic evening last night, and from your faces this morning, I can see that most of you did. I hope you're having a great day so far. I know the morning session was just fantastic. I want to point out that in your packets are a few things very germane to Karen's talk, to Gordon's talk, and some other resources we've talked about. It's a pretty extensive annotated bib in there about positive youth development and diversity that you may want to look through, that I think fuels a lot of very interesting conversations about positive youth development at all levels, so take a peek at that. Benjamin, are we good to go? Awesome. It is truly a full circle experience to welcome our next speaker. And in your packets is a pretty extensive and exhaustive bio of Dr. Bazemore, which I'm not going to read. I'd rather just tell you what I know of him and share some of my experiences and reflections about him just for a moment, if I might. He is currently professor and director of the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice and the director of the Community Justice Institute at Florida Atlantic University. But I have known of Gordon's work for probably 15 years. And sometimes when people say to me, oh, I don't want to write, I hate writing, I always say to them, have you ever read something that's changed your life? How many of you ever read something that's changed your life? Most of us. If that's happened to you, that at some level you sort of inherit a responsibility to keep passing that along and write something that's going to change someone else's life. And when I think of that statement, I do think of Gordon, because I know very early on in my career, reading Gordon's work truly changed my life, truly helped me think about a way of being involved in the issue of justice and the nexus between kids and justice and community, and really introduced the idea in this country that a healing framework and a restorative framework was every bit as important as any other kind of framework, a risk framework or a therapeutic framework, other kinds of frameworks. But I also want to say Gordon is an extraordinarily generous thinker, a prolific thinker, a prolific scholar, a fantastic leader. He's a very generous person, and as a very baby bird, newly minted PhD with just a bunch of ideas in my head about what I thought about strength-based approaches and the way they might fit in the justice system, I read his stuff and I boldly did, as one only does when one is a brand new baby bird PhD, called him up and said, I truly admire you, and what do you think? Here's my idea. And I made an instrument on evaluating strengths in kids based on your article. Is that okay? And what do you think of that? And he was so generous with me and spent a lot of time. We corresponded. We ended up doing a little bit of writing together. I will never forget it, and I have truly tried to emulate that, I think, in my own work. When I thought about taking the Reclaiming Futures job, one of the first people I called was Gordon to ask his advice about whether I should do it or not, and he gave me great advice about doing it, and of course he said, you absolutely must do it. He has influenced people all over the world, especially in this country, but all over the world, as you see from his list of publications and accomplishments. And it is with great joy and admiration and respect that I introduce you to Dr. Gordon Bazemore, and he's going to talk to us about this nexus of positive youth development, community, and our justice work. So, with love and appreciation, Gordon, welcome.
Well, thanks, Laura, for setting me up. All these expectations are going to be out there. Whatever it was she was talking about happened probably 20 years ago or something. So I don't know if I've improved or gone downhill, Laura. So anyway, it's really great to be here. I want to thank both Lauras, Laura Nissen and Laura Hernandez, for helping to set this up and get me organized, and also Benjamin, who helped me with my PowerPoint. It's really an honor to be here, and I'm intimidated by some of the folks that you've heard from already. Connie Flanagan, Karen Pittman, even that kind of lazy David Altshuler over there. I think I'm probably going to be okay, because anybody that let David Altshuler, it's going to be all right. very nervous, actually. So I'll be, jumping around and doing all that weird stuff I shouldn't do. I am basically one of those useless people who does research. I'm not really hands-on at all. Although I will tell you, I'm not going to tell you all of my research that's going on right now. But my colleague Mark Schiff and I are working out in Belle Glade, one of the poorest communities in the country, maybe in the world. And we're doing school reform, trying to keep assistant principals from suspending so many kids. And when I think about the difference between research and practice, it just comes together there, because we're doing way more practice and coaching and encouragement out there than you would do in any research project. A couple of quick observations, I think, just to maybe get us on the same page. You're probably going to disagree with me about a lot of things I say, but what I'm seeing right now with young people, having looked at this issue for 30 years or so now, nothing is easy or clear-cut today for young people, and I think it's getting worse than ever. 40, 50, 60 years ago, the paths to success for young people were pretty clear. You got a job in the family business, plenty of other kinds of jobs out there available for people. Today, the big problem is, if you had to use one word for kids, it's work. We're just really losing our job opportunities. And I'm not going to say much about that today, but I wanted to kind of get us all focused on that, and I think you're seeing the same thing I am. Kids just don't have the kind of job opportunities that even we did as kids, but particularly going back 60 years or so. Today, young people are not needed anymore. They're expendable, they're extraneous, they're supposedly at war with adults and with other youth in many cases. What many of you have read Mike Vale's Scapegoat Generation 10, 15 years ago. That was a shock to me to read and think about that, the stuff he was saying in that book. I think it's way worse today. So we're not really starting from a great place in terms of youth development here, but I think we've learned a lot in any case. I confess also that I'm not as up on some of the more interesting youth development literature right now, and I've been trying to read some things lately, and I want to get caught up with it. I do a lot more research on and development on restorative justice, but I want to go back and read some of the newer stuff. What I'm seeing and what I'm reading is that lots of people are talking a lot about deficits, a lot about kid deficits. I just read a paper the other day, and it's sort of like every paragraph. It was a very good paper, well-researched and everything, but it was like, here's all the problems with kids. Here's what they can't do. Okay? And so what I've always tried to think about, and I'm not sure if I learned this from a lot of people, but just think about, the positive. What can kids do? What could they do if we would let them? And I think that's the way we need to go today. I'm going to talk about three different things. I was asked to do this, and I probably am not going to get through a lot of this stuff, but I think there are three major components that are at play today, and I think it's right there on the screen for you. Positive youth development. I'm trying to make some improvements in that if we can. The second one is restorative justice. I'm going to talk about that a little bit as really, if nothing else, a way of resolving conflicts, a way of teaching young people something that many of us never learned when we were coming up. How do you resolve conflicts? There are ways to do that, and restorative justice goes beyond that. It's a different way of holding young people and adults accountable than the old punitive way, which we're very familiar with. And the final thing I want to touch on, and this may be the most important part, the urgent need for effective community building strategies. Really that village kind of approach, that collective efficacy kind of approach. Just looking back historically, I want to say that maybe Jeff Butts and I were the only two people in the country to have been exposed to people you don't even know the names anymore, but a guy named Arthur Pearl and Ken Polk, both at the University of Oregon. I was inspired by these guys, even though today I think in many ways they were just crazy. They were outrageous. and I think that's what you have to be working with kids, right? And those of you who have kids know what I'm talking about. You just have to be willing to be nuts to do this stuff. I'll tell you quickly a little bit about my background. I was just thinking the other day, I was a young person once. I don't remember much about it. I had lots of challenges growing up. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, which was a very... Somebody's from Memphis. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. I'm about to say some things that you and others might know about it. Memphis was a very challenging place to grow up. I grew up when I was in high school, and I discovered that, the city council was kind of controlled by the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, it was a mean, nasty, racist place. And I was about ready in my 20s to get out of there as quickly as I could, and then I moved to the University of Oregon, to go to university, and I found out there was this town, several towns in southern Oregon that burned crosses. And I thought, wow, I go all the way across the country and it's still here. So we had to have those kinds of challenges. On the lighter side, I will say that Memphis was kind of a cool and interesting place to grow up. I started to say, go Grizzlies. They made it into the playoffs this year, for those who are interested in basketball, and lost. I'm going to stop talking about my background now, but I want to just tell you 3 good things about Memphis. They all start with an R. So this is my tour guide pitch here. The first one is ribs. And when you go to Memphis, you will be eating pork ribs. They're made out of pork. The second one is, as you all know, I hope you know, rock and roll started in Memphis, and it was, built on the blues, the folks coming up from the Delta, and it was Jerry Lee Lewis and Carl Perkins, B.B. King, Bobby Blue Bland, and others, and that was great. That was great. The third R is what we used to call wrestling. You would call it wrestling. We call it wrestling. We never use that word. We thought it started with an R. And so we would watch this thing every Saturday morning. My brothers and I would watch what was called studio wrestling in Memphis. You guys still have studio wrestling in Memphis? And then we'd go out and beat the crap out of each other. That was kind of how I grew up, and it made me probably kind of weird person I am today. All right, let me see if I can get this thing to work, and we'll start into something a little more serious. I'm going to talk about youth development first, and this is kind of my take on it. It's not particularly new. Some of it goes way back to what Jeff Butts and I learned from Ken Polk. I think it still kind of applies today. Youth development is really that universal need. It's a need for all young people to acquire some kinds of skills, and we have to figure out new ways to do that. And they need new supports as well, if they're going to really get to be, positive contributing adults. That's not one of my kids. Strategy and focus. The strategies, and I know you probably talked about this, but I think we have to get away from the kind of therapeutic approach, making everything something that can be resolved by counseling. Some things fit that, some do not. And it's not really a remedial approach. It's a strength-focused approach, and that's a term you've heard from Laura and others for a long time. Keystones of youth development. We're talking here, again, this is outrageous and impossible, okay? This is sort of, but this is, I think, what we should aim for. Sustained pro-social developmental relationships with one or more caring adults. You've all heard that, you've all talked about that. My favorite quote there is from a prosecutor, Ronnie Earl from Texas, who once said, what we really need is people who are irrationally crazy about young people. Think about that. Irrationally crazy. You can kind of be nuts to do this stuff. Social competency and strengths-based assumptions. social competency and strengths-based assumptions. Use capacity, and this came right from Ken Polk. He said that this is what it is. Use capacity to do something well that other people value. Really simple, really important. And then the other side is even more important. No, not deficit-based, not deficit-based. We try to get around that by finding what it is kids can do well. Core assumptions. Youth will, most of the time, will thrive and develop positively when they have the ongoing support of one or more pro-social adults. Hopefully more than one, hopefully more than 3, 4, 5. What are the relevant theories around this? I'm not going to be, real theoretical here, but I think it's important to acknowledge, Laura, that, I think a lot of the work you were talking about that you were doing and I was trying to do was really around this idea of social support theory. Just this intimate, ultimate need for someone to just hang with you, to be irrationally crazy about you. Control theory, many of you are familiar with that. I think the commitment and attachment dimensions are really important. Role transformation, getting kids to be, and adults as well, to step out of maybe the rut they're in and transform their roles. Informal social control, collective efficacy, and restorative justice, and we'll say more about that later. Research on that, there's a much longer list, but if these terms help you find it and access some of this research, that's important. The resiliency research, which many of you have heard about, it means that some of the kids that you would think were least likely to make it from the worst kinds of backgrounds and families end up doing it. And there's something about that notion of resiliency, and I don't think we've measured it that well yet, but if we could predict what kids would make it, and we could make it possible for more kids to make it. Life course studies are the kind of version of resiliency research for adults, and this comes a lot out of the criminological literature that finds that really, even some really bad actors that have been in prison multiple times can get over that and come back and be productive citizens. And of course, restorative justice there. Absolute belonging. What does that mean? Well, these are interventions that place kids in positions, in roles that help them connect to pro-social adults. Oftentimes I go and look at youth programs and they're all kids there. They're kids doing stuff and doing it together, and maybe it's good, but we don't really have enough positive adults that work with some of the kids that you work with. Core assumptions of social competency and strengths-based assumptions. One of the big ones, and again, this was some of the things that I learned in Oregon, at least, youth learn by doing. And sometimes that means we've got to put them in a role where they can be successful, where they can be doing something that helps other people. We think of kids as helpless and needing help and needing more counseling and all that stuff. A lot of those same kids need to be given a role. Cross-age tutoring, you all know about that. That's one of the oldest forms of where older kids teach, who are failing in school, teach younger kids, and the older kids improve their grades. Some relevant new theories. This one, if you are interested in prison reform and re-entry programs, Shad Maroon wrote a wonderful book a few years ago. And he said he took it from Eric Erickson, but he used the term generativity. And that means, again, just another way of what we were talking about earlier, learning to become a good person by helping other people. Shad was doing mostly a qualitative research project that took 6 or 8 years, but he also collected data on this, and he found out that these kind of younger to middle-aged offenders that were able to reform themselves took on this idea of, I want to come out because I want to help other people, and I want to help other kids. And that was a term that Eric Erickson supposedly called generativity, becoming good by doing good. Also in the mix, experiential learning, exchange theories, emphasizing reciprocity between offenders, and you heard from Connie, I think, yesterday about civic engagement. again, something else that touches it. Why not get them involved in voter registration or something where they're going to feel a connection to the community? Helper principle, you've heard about that one as well, and it kind of dovetails with some of these other things. Cross-sex tutoring, older kids teaching younger kids, etc. So there's too many words right there, but you know, maybe some wisdom underneath that. You can have a look at that for yourself. The idea is changing roles. When people ask me about youth development, say it in one word: changing the role of the young person, getting them out of that role that they're stuck in, getting them in a productive role. So we need to change the conditions or create new conditions for young people where they can thrive and be successful. And a lot of this, you know, it should involve paying young people, but it doesn't have to. Paid work is very good, but you know, a lot of kids want to do volunteer work and are willing to do that. And there's some citations on these crazy. Strong relationships, and this is the end of this part of the presentation. Strong relationships are inadequate without skill, competency development opportunities. So you really can't have one without the other. If you want strong relationships with adults, there's a need for kids to have competency. And then just switching it, turning it right around. Skill building without strong relationships with pro-social adults is not going to get us there. Anybody with a question or two at this point? I'm going to ask this between sort of three parts to this. Okay? Everybody all right? Okay, I want to now turn to the restorative justice model and what that does for us. We have a real kind of problem with the notion of justice in this country. What do people think about when we say someone has been brought to justice? What does brought to justice mean? Accountability. Prosecuted. Punished. We said it with Bin Laden last week. We were brought into justice.
Went to court.
Went to court, perhaps? Yeah. A lot of ways of thinking about that. In restorative justice, we really try to broaden that. But the reality is most people think of justice as punishment. I don't care if they're school teachers or probation officers or judges or whatever. They think retribution. We're taught to think that. We're taught to think punishment is the only thing we can do, and it does people a lot of good. In this field, and you're working with kids, and so you're probably thinking there may be some justice in treatment. Treatment is certainly needed for a lot of kids, and it may help them, but does it really have anything to do with justice? For years, I think, you know, the juvenile justice system was just all about treatment. It actually punished kids a lot as well, but they said they were all about treatment. In the 80s and 90s, people began to kind of rethink that and to think that maybe we need a different kind of justice. And that is what we call in restorative justice really accountability and responsibility. Just to be clear about that, a lot of people use accountability to mean what? Punishment. That's not what we're talking about. Laura knows that over the years, we've really tried to change it. Accountability is really important. That's being responsible, right? Accountability and responsibility. We want our kids to do that.
I actually think about a lot of people that I work with think of accountability as paying restitution as well. Paying back.
Yeah, there are many, it's paying back. It's fixing what you've broken, it's giving back. That's a sort of core idea in restorative justice. And we have to be careful with it like that. I mean, people can still say, okay, we're holding the kid accountable, and we're making them do all this nasty work, we're making them pick up paper along the roadsides. It's the one that I hate the most. And it doesn't hold anybody accountable as far as I can see. But The important thing is that how restorative justice looks at breaking the law. Most of the time, for most of us, when a crime is committed, we want to know three things. Who done it? What kind of jail are we going to put this person in? And I forgot the third one. I'll think of it later. We'll go with two.
Something about the victim?
Something about the what?
Was there a victim? The victim okay?
That's always left out as well. The victim is always left out. But just to keep moving forward here, crime is, the big idea of restorative justice, crime is more than just breaking the law. It's not just about breaking the law. Crime hurts people. Harms victims directly. It harms communities, sometimes directly and sometimes indirectly. And it hurts offenders and their families. So what's important about crime from a restorative perspective is not necessarily that you broke the law. That's important. The law is important. But what's really important is it's bigger than that. It's that you've actually hurt people. And you've hurt relationships. In restorative justice, relationship becomes a big deal. Because oftentimes people have a fight, kids have a fight, families have internal fights, fight with other communities. And sometimes what's going on there is you've got good relationships. People get mad at each other. Relationships get broken by crime and harm. It's a very cool little graphic. Thanks to Ben for doing that. So let me do that one more time. If crime is a wound, from a restorative perspective, then justice, a nice little cushion on the lake, should be healing. Justice is really about healing. We're trying to fix what was broken rather than be concerned with retribution. Restorative justice partners well with lots of different approaches. Positive youth development, competency, lots of good things. The only place where restorative justice advocates draw the line is with retribution. You think about it, what does retribution get for us? Regardless of what Andrew Von Hirsch says, it doesn't make anybody better. It may be justice in some people's lives, but it doesn't make anybody better. Restorative justice has been around a long time. It's an ancient kind of approach. Early Aboriginal societies all over the world practiced a form of restorative justice. They basically sat in circles and talked to each other and resolved conflict in that way. So nothing at all new about this. Big ideas here: crime is a violation of people and relationships. That creates obligations. Obligations, not punishment, obligations. The central obligation is to fix it, put right and wrong. And how do our courts do when we think about this? Lewis Herman says it this way: if you set out to create a system to generate post-traumatic stress, you couldn't do better than a court of law. Does that make any sense to you? Except for some do. Key stakeholders in restorative justice. A lot of you have heard this before, but this is really this is a more collective kind of approach. We're thinking not only of the offender. This whole system is built around the offender. We never think much about the victim at all. But in this approach, we're thinking about the victim first in many ways, and we're beginning to think about the needs of community, because you can have very good things going on, but communities can be really messed up. This is something that we had a project a few years ago called the Balance and Restorative Justice Project. The late Dennis Maloney came up with this idea of a triangle. Again, Dennis was kind of wrestling with this idea of, is treatment alone enough? And sometime in the late 80s, he decided, no, it's really not. The community expects other things from us. And number one is community protection. And so Dennis came up with this triangle that says, well, if we want to be any good, if we want to be of any value to the community, we better think community protection. That doesn't mean locking everybody up. It means there are, all kinds of strategies for protecting community. It also means accountability, and as I've defined accountability, that doesn't mean taking punishment. It means taking responsibility. The third one is what Dennis called competency development, and that just meant that as young people go through the system and come out of the system, they should be better off than when they went in. How many juvenile justice systems can say that? It's a very good goal. And you see around the circle there are the three stakeholders, and I repeat that over and over again just because that's who we're looking at in restorative justice. Core values of restorative justice. Respect for offenders and victims, inclusion, flexibility. Restorative justice folks I've worked with are very, very flexible and wanting to find ways to get to a better place. Trust, truthfulness, compassion, understanding, empathy. Something I want to say about crime victims. There's been a lot of talk about crime victims, or talk about the angry victim. But a lot of people in juvenile justice will say they're just angry. They're all out for blood. I don't really find that. I don't think there's much research that shows that. Mary Achilles was the state victim advocate in Pennsylvania for a number of years, retired recently. And she, as a victim's advocate, was kind of criticizing her own work and saying that, we as victims advocates don't even do a very good job. How can we expect anybody else to do a good job? And she was wrestling with this idea of punishment and saying, just what you see there, victims really, if you gave them a choice, they might not be punitive. If you give me a choice that says, oh, do we let this guy go? Or do we put him in jail? What's the average victim going to say? If those are your choices, jail, you've hurt me, or we're going to let him off, which one would you take? Most of us are going to take something because it's the only kind of accountability available. So one of the reasons that victims seem to want more time for the offenders is that we don't give them anything else. We don't know what they want, so we play the Price is Right with victims. Remember that game? Price is Right. Door number 1, door number 2, door number 3, door number 4, maybe they want door number 5, 6, and 7. So those of you who work with victims or just encounter them in your work, if you can kind of keep that in mind. This doesn't necessarily just come from restorative justice, it's just a good idea. What is it victims require for justice? In a broad definition, their first issue is safety. Am I going to be hurt again? Am I going to be harmed? Some answers to their questions. Some victims will be victims that have for 20 years, and offenders locked up or murdered their daughter. But for some reason, they want to go and find out what happened in that murder. And it seems like an odd thing to us, but sometimes victims just want more information, and it's that information that helps them to go through a healing process. Empowerment, vindication. Vindication doesn't mean being victim, it doesn't mean victimizing. It means that if I'm the victim, it wasn't my fault. Victims want to have the air cleared about that. It wasn't my fault. If you're a woman wearing a short dress and you're victimized, it's not your fault. You've been harmed, you've been hurt, you've been raped. So that's what we mean by vindication. What do victims really want? Usually they say they want something that looks like restorative justice, at least less formal process. They don't like the court process. The court process is not friendly to most victims. They want more information. We all want that. They sometimes want to participate in the cases. material and emotional restoration. What do offenders need? From a restorative perspective, they need opportunities to take responsibility for the harm their behaviors caused. Hopefully then they take action to repair the harm. That's the second part of restorative justice. What are you going to do to make things right? You need to have a voice in the decision-making process. Both victims and offenders need that. Opportunities for reintegration into their communities. A really important part of that. But you don't start the reintegration until you've had that opportunity for victim-offender community to meet. Here are some of the practices that come out of restorative justice. Pretty straightforward. Opportunities for apologizing, and victims accept apologies a lot when they are genuine, and they can tell that, and most people in the restorative process can tell whether the apology is legit, is serious or not. Making restitution to victims, providing restorative community service, participating in victim awareness activities. Here are the models. I think some of you have seen those. I'm not going to go through all of those, but there are now 7, 8, 9 models of restorative conferencing. What we mean by restorative conferencing is this is what the only practice out there used to be victim-offender mediation. Now there are multiple ways of solving problems around crime. Family group conferencing, for example, came to us from I'm forgetting the country it came from now. I'll think of it in a minute. It came from Australia as well as New Zealand. And family group conferencing talked about bringing in the whole family group, basically, relatives, others, because these were some tribal folks that were doing this, and that's now become popular around the world. Neighborhood accountability boards are basically recruit volunteers to hear cases. Sentencing and peacemaking circles, a little bit different. They use what's called a talking stick to resolve conflict. So if you took these 4 tables here, put them into one big table, you would sit around the circle, pass the talking stick around. You can talk for as long as you have the talking stick, and when you pass the talking stick, you have to shut up. So it's a process that allows everybody to talk, but they're not all talking at once. We're not screaming at each other. For example. Such a picture there. This is making nicer. When community control is weak, criminal justice systems take over. Pretty profound thought, I think, here from Australian criminologist David Moore. Critique of our formal court or other kinds of formal justice procedures. These procedures deprive people of opportunities to practice apology and forgiveness, or reconciliation, restitution, reparation. The modern state has taken this away from us, basically. It's deprived civil society of opportunities to learn important political skills. Some of you may have seen this. It comes right out in youth development. And it says basically that kids don't grow up in programs. It challenges us to think of other ways than sending kids to programs. What we really need is not more services, but really more ways for kids to become engaged. Why does this work? We asked that question when Mara Schiff and I were doing our study of restored justice around the country. Whenever we could, we would ask people that question, why does restored justice work? And here's what some of these volunteers said, and it's pretty interesting, I think. It works because we're not getting paid to do this. You know, why would anybody say that? Well, what these folks said is that kids can tell if somebody really wants to be there helping them. And it's not that they don't like professionals who are doing it, but they may be a little bit suspicious. You know, it's just my job. You know, I get paid for it, and then I go on to the next kid. So that was, I thought, pretty profound. We can exercise the authority that parents may have lost, and God knows that happens a lot, doesn't it? Sometimes parents lose their authority for a few minutes and hours. And what some of these folks were retired elderly people, and they had the most empathy I've ever seen for some parents whose kids were in trouble. And they said, you know, I went through that. And just hearing that, I think from older folks, and you're trying to raise your kids, you know, it's okay. This kind of stuff is going to happen. We live in their community. We're neighbors. We're not outsiders who come into the community and say, look, I'll fix your kid. We give them input into the contract. So they're the deciders, if you will. We're a group of neighbors who care about them. They hear about the harm from real human beings, us and the victims. Maybe the most important one is we don't go away. We're here. We're in the neighborhood. We're here for you, and if we can't be, we'll find somebody else. I'm going to move quickly through these. How's my time looking now?
How about 10 minutes? You want some time for questions?
Okay. I do, and I think I just want to make a couple of initial points about part 3. This idea of social capital and restorative decision making, and the idea of how we build communities. I'm just going to hit a couple of these, and then I want to take as many questions as you have. I put these first because I think this is sort of what it's all about. It's not just about the offender. Some of you are advocates, and you know, of John McKnight, who's said some pretty profound things. And John has been known to criticize services and treatment. And here's what he said. Services focused on efficiency tend to be pathways out of community and into the exclusion of service life. So we need to distinguish between those kinds of processes that lead people out of community and those that keep it there. This is kind of all about social capital. Let's just end right there, I think. What does that mean? What's that? Where's Ben? Ben, I think that those birds are the best thing. What do you think there? We'll leave it at that. Low crime communities are communities that don't lie in numbers. The last part of this, which I'm not going to get to, but I'd be glad to send it to you or send some papers about it, is really about the social capital in communities. This is not about doing it, doing it yourself. It's not about being a good or bad parent. It's about creating some possibility for what sociologists call parochial control, control from the village, and creating collective efficacy in all of us. Questions? Yes, sir.
Perhaps you saw it there.
Jen Waller, just one second, just bring it a mic so people can hear you.
For those of us who have to sit on the bench, we may be feeling a little under fire here, but the one element that I believe in restorative justice, but the one element that I didn't see comment on was that community, that sense of values. In other words, so we do have the offender and we have the victim, and then hopefully we have the judge who is a representative of that community saying, and in addition to what everyone else thinks is appropriate, that there is this social norm or set of values that we are trying to maintain. And so, and I didn't see, maybe I missed that.
The set of values that you're trying to to me, I'm not sure exactly what you mean. Go ahead, yeah. Say that one more time.
Well, in other words, for those of us who've also been in adult court, many times you will get the victim coming in and saying, you know, I don't see any need for a consequence other than this, and obviously the offender is on favor of that. There's also that community element that says, okay, there is a, you know, there's an additional price or consequence here that if you are going to engage in this type of behavior, there's also that consequence that has to be paid on behalf of society. And again, I think that all rolls into one when you include society as part of that victim comment. But when you isolate it to this particular victim and the particular offender, I think you leave out that third component there. And judges who are like it are very sensitive to that.
Yeah, certainly judges play a major role in that. And I think a lot of the judges that buy into restorative justice, they want to get everything out of the court that they can. They want that community input. And they take it seriously. They can't always do it. I mean, you're legal official and representatives of the state. I mean, there's some things you can't do. You know better than I do. But the judges that have been really successful in this want the community in, and they want them to maximize the extent to which they take care of problems locally. There's still plenty of role for the judge to do, by the way. Yes, sir.
Mark Fulop of National Office. Can you comment a little bit on the trend of restorative justice as a movement? It's kind of gone up and down, in vogue, out of vogue. Where is it now? Where is it, in your opinion, moving, and how can you think about restorative justice going forward?
Yeah, I kind of worry about that a lot. And I if I had time, I would do another kind of national survey to try to figure out. I'm being told that some states are going gung-ho, a lot more programs. Many states are losing their funds and so dropping programs of all kinds. So that said, what the state of the movement, I'm not sure. I really would need to do a big research project to figure it out. What I am happy about is restorative justice being used for all kinds of things. It's not just for sisters. It's used in Rwanda. You know, people coming back home to folks that live next door to it that have murdered their loved ones. Truth and Reconciliation Commission based on that. Some of you who know this stuff, you could just name a whole bunch of examples of where restorative justice has been used. It's also been used in highly violent crimes. That doesn't mean you're letting people out of prison. It means victims are coming in and resolving it. So the answer is I'm not sure, but I'm pretty happy with the state of affairs. And let me mention one more thing about research. I'm going to say this up front. A lot of research out there now. 18 years ago, I couldn't have said that. I could say, 5, 10 studies, probably 75 to 100, studies, and at least half of that number rigorous, experimental designs, things like that. A guy named Larry Sherman, for some reason, got interested in this with John Braithwaite, and they started doing all these major studies. No negative results from that. It doesn't mean there's not negative stuff happening in conferences. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I've always thought that restorative justice, a wonderful platform for it would be schools. And, we as judges and here, see the schools often passing kids off to the court to solve the problem. And I'm kind of curious if you know how receptive departments of education and schools in general have been to restorative justice as a way to resolve some of the conflicts within that very discrete community that kids spend most of their time in.
I'm glad you asked that question because my colleague and I are spending almost all our time in school now. We thought this would be a little project we have hardly any money for. But what we're finding is from the assistant principal on down, some teachers, they're looking for better things to do to get kids out. I mean, in Bellblade where we're working, these are pretty much all African American schools. Not all, but many of those schools are low achieving and have a track record of just they run out of things to do, and so these kids get suspended. But again, the same people who live in that community, they want to keep those kids. And so they're very interested in restorative justice as a way of let's sit kids down, let's have them talk about their conflict, let's have them talk about why they call the teacher a curse word, because that's almost all. And if I had to count what's going to get a kid kicked out of school, it's call your teacher a D word. So yeah, I think the schools are maybe the new frontier for restorative justice. And that's not just here. We've been doing this stuff in cities like Chicago,
Get the mic. Thank you.
Professor, restorative justice is a concept that I've had the pleasure of working with you on, and it's a model. We have this Reclaiming Futures model as well, and I see it all related under the concept of therapeutic jurisprudence. And I wonder if you could address that concept, and in that regard, I've done a survey through the internet, and there are some 26 therapeutic jurisprudence courses being offered at the law school level, which to me is precursor to the thought being integrated and the like. And yet on those 26 courses, there are probably 26,000 that there really should be.
Good. Yeah, I think you're right about that. I can say the same thing for restorative justice. What I do know about is people send me emails about this. Did you know that this university is doing this full-blown course in restorative justice? And I say, no, I didn't know it, and I'm really pissed off because we're not really doing much. Just two of us teach restorative classes, but they have whole restorative justice tracks in schools around the country. I couldn't name all of them for you now. That was part of your question. The other one was therapeutic.
The concept of restorative justice being a model for the application of therapeutic jurisprudence.
Oh, yeah.
And how that would relate specifically here to our Reclaiming Futures model, and how that fits into this broad rubric of therapeutic jurisprudence.
Okay, yeah. We've had a talk about this. I don't particularly like the word therapy for this, but I don't really care either. As long as it does something good. And I have heard that there's this kind of alliance, that this is going back 10 years, this alliance emerged between therapeutic jurisprudence and restorative justice. The value base is clearly there. It's the same value base. It's just with restorative justice, there's a little bit of pushback on, well, do we need a therapist? Do we always need a therapist, or can we just kind of pull our community together and talk about it? There are times when you just need a therapist and times when you just don't. But I think we ought to make that alliance a lot closer.
So I think we have time for one last question.
Okay, well, thank you very much.